In the year 1846, the British Parliament passed 272 separate acts authorising the construction of new railways. 4,500 miles of new line were approved in that single year for a country about 600 miles long. The capital committed to railway schemes in the mid-1840s exceeded the annual income of the entire nation. At the peak, it is estimated that railway investment was absorbing money at a rate no private undertaking in human history had ever absorbed it. Clergymen invested, widows invested, the Brontë sisters invested, Charles Darwin invested. Members of Parliament invested in schemes they would then vote on in their hundreds, and nobody thought that remarkable enough to prevent. And standing at the centre of it all was a draper from York, a heavy, blunt, barely lettered businessman who at his height controlled nearly a third of the railway network of England, dined with royalty, commanded the largest private fortune machine in the country, and was known in every newspaper in Britain by a title no financier before him had ever carried. They called him the Railway King, and unlike most such titles, this one was not tabloid decoration. It described a real sovereignty over boards, over Parliament's railway committees, over the savings of a nation, and over the one number everyone watched, the price of his shares. For roughly 5 years, no private individual in Britain commanded more capital or more faith. Within 5 years of that peak, the schemes had collapsed, the shares had lost most of their value, a generation of middle-class savers had been ruined, many of them twice over, in a way we will explain, because the mechanism of their ruin is the most instructive part of this story, and the Railway King had been exposed, disgraced, and driven from the country he had briefly seemed to own. And yet, and this is what makes the railway mania unlike almost every other bubble this channel has covered, the railways got built. That is the strange, difficult heart of this story, and we will come back to it at the end. A speculative catastrophe that ruined its investors and endowed its country, a mania that functioned by accident as the most brutal infrastructure financing scheme ever devised. This is the story of the railway mania of the 1840s, the genuine miracle that started it, the machinery of scrip and calls that turned a nation into speculators, the man whose name was the market, and the crash that fell hardest on the people who could least afford it, including 2 sisters in a Yorkshire parsonage whose letters preserve the whole disaster in miniature. Start with the miracle, because every great mania begins with something true. A person born in Britain in 1800 entered a world that moved at the speed of a horse. Nothing on land had ever moved faster, not for the Romans, not for the Tudors, not for anyone. News, goods, armies, ideas, everything travelled at the pace of legs, hooves, and sails, as it had for the whole of human history. That person, at 30, could stand at a fence in Lancashire and watch the Liverpool and Manchester Railway open, the first true intercity line in the world, and see a machine pull a train of carriages at 30 miles an hour. By their 40s, expresses were approaching 60. In a single generation, the fundamental constant of human movement, unchanged for 10,000 years, had multiplied several times over. It is genuinely difficult, from inside our own century, to feel how violent that was. The railway did not improve the existing world, it replaced it. Journey times between cities fell from days to hours. Fresh food, daily newspapers, cheap coal, standardized time itself. The very clocks of England were synchronized because the trains demanded it. Nothing in the country was left untouched. And crucially, for our story, the early railways made money. Real money, openly declared. The Liverpool and Manchester paid dividends of 9 and 10% year after year, at a time when government bonds paid 3. The Stockton and Darlington enriched its Quaker backers. The great trunk lines of the 1830s, the London and Birmingham, the Grand Junction, carried more traffic than their promoters had dared forecast. Hold that fact, because it is the seed of everything. This was not tulip bulbs, and it was not the South Sea. The technology was real, the transformation was real, and the profits, the early profits, were real and published. Every catastrophic mania this channel has covered contains a kernel of truth that made the first investors rich and the last investors certain. The dot-com crash had the internet. Enron had a genuinely brilliant gas business. The railway mania had the most transformative machine of the 19th century, visibly coining money. The lesson people took from the 1830s was simple, reasonable, and lethal. Railways pay. Now the machinery, because a mania needs more than a story. It needs a mechanism that lets ordinary people bet more than they have. And the 1840s built a beautiful one. You could not simply build a railway in Britain. Every line needed its own Act of Parliament, powers to compulsorily purchase land, to cross roads and rivers, to exist as a company. So the sequence ran like this. A group of promoters, engineers, lawyers, local worthies, sometimes chancers with nothing but a map and a name, formed a provisional committee. They published a prospectus, the route, the traffic estimates, the glorious future, and they invited the public to subscribe for shares. Here is the crucial detail, the same detail, you may notice, that sat inside our over-end gurney story, wearing different clothes. You did not pay for your shares. You paid a deposit, typically around 5%, and received scrip, a certificate entitling you to the shares when called upon to pay the rest, installment by installment, as construction proceeded. Run the arithmetic on what that means. With £50, a person could take up £1,000 of railway shares. If the scheme was popular and the scrip rose to a premium, as scrip in a hot market reliably did, they could sell the certificate itself, never paying another installment, and pocket the difference. A clerk with modest savings could deal in thousands of pounds of nominal capital on a deposit in an instrument that traded like cash. That is leverage, margin trading in modern language, offered to the whole literate public of Britain, decades before anyone had invented the vocabulary to warn them. The scrip system converted a nation of savers into a nation of speculators, and it did so through an instrument that felt, in the rising market of 1844 and 1845, like a machine for free money. Buy the allotment, watch the premium, sell to the next man. The practice even had a name, stagging, and respectable people did it who would have been horrified to be called gamblers. But remember what the scrip actually was, because everyone holding it chose to forget. It was not an asset. It was a contract to pay the remaining 95% on demand whenever the company called for it. Every certificate in every drawer in England was a debt wearing an asset's clothing. We will meet those calls again. Now add the gatekeepers, and watch each one fail in turn. Parliament was the sieve through which every scheme had to pass, and Parliament was invested. By the height of the Mania, members holding railway shares or seats on railway boards numbered in the hundreds. The committees scrutinising railway bills were substantially manned by men with money in railways. Schemes multiplied because approval multiplied, and approval multiplied because the approvers were shareholders. Nobody had to be corrupt in the envelope of cash sense for that to end badly. The conflict did the work all by itself, as it did at Enron's auditor, as it did with the analysts of the dot-com years. A check that profits from the boom does not check the boom. The press did no better. The newspapers of the 1840s swelled with railway advertising, prospectus after prospectus, page after page, at premium rates. Whole new papers existed for nothing else. At the peak, there were more than a dozen railway journals. The Times, to its credit, thundered warnings about the mania, while collecting a fortune in railway advertisement revenue with the other hand. The information system the public relied on was being paid handsomely by the thing it was supposed to appraise. And the government? The Board of Trade made one serious attempt to impose order, a committee to evaluate schemes on their merits. And it was overwhelmed and effectively swept aside in 1845. There was no other regulator. There was no companies' legislation worth the name, no accounting standards, no audit profession. The investing public of the 1840s walked into the largest capital market event in history, protected by nothing but their own judgment and the honor of promoters. Pause here and take stock of the architecture before the king enters, because the Mania of 1845 was, structurally, a perfect machine with every safety removed. A genuinely transformative technology with published profits to prove it. A leveraged instrument, the scrip, placing that story within reach of every purse in Britain, at 20-to-1 gearing nobody thought of as gearing. Gatekeepers, parliament, press, profession, each compensated by the boom they were supposed to police. No accounting standards, no audit, no disclosure law. Nothing between a promoter's arithmetic and a widow's legacy but the promoter's conscience. And a public whose only financial education was the observable fact that everyone who had bought railway shares so far had won. Every mania this channel has covered assembles some of those parts. The 1840s assembled all of them at once, in the largest economy on earth, around the most important invention of the age. The only thing missing was a face, a single name to carry the public's faith, as names carried it at Overend Gurney and at Enron. History supplied one within the year. Into this world came George Hudson. He was not a gentleman and never pretended to be. A draper's apprentice from York, who inherited an unexpected fortune, he put it into the infant York railway schemes in the 1830s and discovered in himself an extraordinary talent, not for engineering, which he never understood, but for amalgamation. Where others promoted single lines, Hudson bought, merged, leased, and consolidated them into systems. The Midland Railway, one of the great companies of English history, was assembled by Hudson out of squabbling fragments. By the late 1840s, the companies he chaired controlled something approaching a third of the network then running. And he understood, before almost anyone, the single most important fact of the share mania. The price of the shares was the business. Keep the dividend high and the share price follows. Keep the share price high and new capital flows in. Keep the capital flowing and you can build, buy and absorb everything in reach. So Hudson paid magnificent dividends. Through the Mania years, his companies paid out at rates that made them the blue chips of the boom, and the money to pay them came, in substantial part, not from the traffic revenues of the railways, but from capital, from the new subscriptions, from the installments paid in by new shareholders, recycled to the old ones as though it were profit. Say it plainly, dividends were being paid out of the shareholders' own money to sustain the share price, to attract more shareholders whose money paid the next dividend. If you have watched our Madoff episode, the shape of that sentence is familiar. But mark the difference too, because it matters for the trial of history. Madoff ran no business at all. There were no trades, only the recycling. Hudson ran real railways, carrying real passengers, earning real revenue, just not enough of it, and papered the gap from capital in accounts that no law then required to be true, audited by nobody in an era whose accounting had no settled rules to break. Whether that makes him a fraud or merely the most aggressive accountant of a lawless age was argued furiously then, and is argued by historians still. We will let the record speak, and you may judge. What is beyond dispute is the scale of the worship while it lasted. Hudson became MP for Sunderland. He bought one of the grandest houses in London and entertained dukes in it. Prince Albert came to dinner. York, his city, hung on his word. A street was named for him. A public subscription was raised to honour him, and subscribers included half of respectable England. When Hudson joined aboard, the shares rose on his name alone. Like the Quaker name at Overend Gurney, like the fortune covers at Enron, his reputation had become a financial instrument in its own right, collateral that everyone accepted and no one could inspect. By 1845, the mania was at full roar. Over 1,000 new schemes were projected in that year alone. Lines to everywhere. Lines duplicating lines. Lines to places whose whole population could have fitted in one train. Subscription lists filled with signatures that ranged from dukes to domestic servants. Investigators later found subscribers who had pledged sums vastly beyond their entire worth on deposits borrowed at interest. And in a parsonage on the Yorkshire moors, the Brontë sisters held shares in the York and North Midland, a Hudson company. The detail is small and perfect, which is why we pause on it. The sisters' aunt had left them a modest legacy, the only capital 3 clergymen's daughters would ever have. Emily managed the investments, and through the boom years the railway shares swelled. Charlotte, the eldest, watched the market with a cool eye that her letters preserve. She thought the shares had risen beyond reason, expected the reckoning, and proposed selling while the premium lasted. Emily would not, and Charlotte, deferring to her sister rather than to her own judgment, let it lie, writing with resignation that she would rather lose the money than quarrel over it. Keep those 3 women in view. They are who a mania actually happens to, not the stags and promoters, but households holding their one legacy in the fashionable security of the day, half knowing better, staying in because selling felt like a betrayal of the general faith. Multiply the parsonage by 100,000 parlours, and you have the real ledger of 1845. Before the turn, 3 more pieces of the world of 1845 deserve their place: the war inside the boom, the men who actually built the thing, and the sheer texture of a country gone railway mad, because the Mania was not only a market, it was a civilization, briefly. First, the war. Not every railway was the same railway, because Britain's 2 great engineering camps had built to different gauges, the width between the rails. George Stephenson's lines and most of the country ran on 4 feet 8.5 inches, a dimension inherited with perfect English logic from colliery tramways. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, building the Great Western, had chosen 7 feet, a broad gauge for speed, stability, and grandeur, and incompatible with everything else. Where the 2 systems met, at places like Gloucester, every passenger and every ton of freight had to be unloaded, carried across a platform, and reloaded, chaos so notorious that it became a national joke and a parliamentary scandal. In 1846, the same Parliament, waving through those 272 acts, also passed the Gauge Act, siding with Stephenson's dimension for the future. Brunel's magnificent outlier was slowly converted over the following decades, and the width of a Northumbrian coal cart became, in time, the standard gauge of most of the railways on Earth, one of history's great examples of an accident becoming an infrastructure, locked in not because it was best, but because it was first and most connected. Investors' note bore the cost of that war too. Duplicate lines were promoted purely as gauge strategy, to seize territory for one camp before the other arrived. Mileage justified by geopolitics rather than traffic, paid for by shareholders who thought they were buying dividends. Second, the navvies, because every pound of that scorched capital was converted into earthworks by human muscle, and the scale of it has no modern equivalent. At the height of construction, the railway workforce approached 250,000 men, the largest concentration of labour in the country, larger than the army and navy together. They dug the cuttings with picks and barrows, drove the tunnels by candlelight through rock and running sand, raised the great viaducts arch by arch, essentially without machinery, at a pace that still astonishes engineers. They were itinerant, hard-living, largely Irish and Northern English, camped in shanty settlements that trailed the works across the shires, feared by respectable villages and indispensable to them. They were also expendable in a way the ledgers never recorded. Deaths and maimings on the great works ran at rates no modern project would survive a week of. The Woodhead Tunnel alone became a byword, with casualty rates compared at the time bitterly to a battlefield. No memorial fund appeared in any prospectus. When the calls stopped and the capital dried in 1847 and 1848, tens of thousands of them were simply turned off, mid-country, wageless, the first and least remembered casualties of the crash, ruined not by shares they never owned, but by the sudden stop of the money that had employed them. Any honest account of the Mania keeps them in the frame. The speculation was paper, but it was cashed in shoulders and lungs. And third, the texture of the madness itself, because the documents of 1845 read like satire and are not. Subscription lists, the signed pledges behind each scheme, demanded by Parliament, were found on examination to include charwomen down for thousands, clerks pledging multiples of their lifetime earnings, names copied from directories, and in the famous cases, men of straw signed up by promoters at so much a signature to swell the list. Punch lived on the Mania for 2 years. Clergymen preached against railway gambling to congregations who held scrip in their hymn books. Provincial share exchanges sprang up in a dozen towns to trade paper that London had never heard of. And letters of the period record the detail that always marks a top in every era: servants, apprentices, and schoolboys discussing premiums the moment, as a later American put it, of 1929, when the shoeshine boy gives you stock tips. When the whole of society is in the market, there is no one left to buy from the last man in. The Mania of 1845 discovered that theorem empirically, and 1847 published the proof. The turn, when it came the way it usually comes, not with a thunderclap, but with a change in the price of money. Through 1845 and 1846, the Bank of England's rate began to rise. Money tightened. And now the beautiful machine of the scrip system went into reverse, because the railways, thousands of miles of them now authorized by all those acts, had to actually be built, and building meant calling up the capital. The calls went out. Pay up the next installment on your shares, then the next. Through 1846, 1847, 1848, the demands arrived by post in their hundreds of thousands, printed forms with a company seal, a sum and a date, each one enforceable at law against everything the holder owned. Contemporaries called the drumbeat of them simply the calls, the way one speaks of the weather. Diaries of the period record households opening the morning's letters in genuine dread. Landowners had to be paid, navvies waged, iron bought, the Mania's paper had to be converted into cuttings and viaducts, and the only source was the shareholders' pockets, exactly as the scrip contracts had always said. Understand the trap closing, because this is the mechanism that made 1847 so much crueler than an ordinary crash. In an ordinary crash, your shares fall and your loss is what you paid. In the railway crash, your shares fell and you still owed the company the unpaid 90-odd% in cash, on schedule, enforceable at law. Selling was no escape once premiums vanished. Scrip at a discount still carried its calls. Families sold houses to meet calls on shares worth a fraction of the sums still owed on them. The instrument that had let a clerk command £1,000 with 50 now presented the bill for the other 950 in the middle of a slump, with the asset itself collapsing. If you watched our Lloyd's episode, or our Overend Gurney episode, you have now seen this creature 3 times in 3 costumes: the unlimited name, the uncalled bank share, the part-paid scrip. Every era offers ordinary people an instrument that pays like an asset in good times and turns into a debt in bad ones, and every era's savers sign, because the calm years have priced the signature at 0. It is the single most reliable ruin machine in financial history, and it is never called a loan. Then, 1847 delivered the general crisis: bad harvests, dear corn, gold draining abroad, the money market seizing. And in the autumn came a full commercial panic, banks and merchant houses failing, the Bank Charter Act suspended for the first time ever, 19 years before Overend Gurney forced the same measure. Railway shares, already sliding for a year, went over the cliff. By 1849, the great index of railway property had fallen by more than half from the peak. The marginal schemes were dead entirely. Their deposits gone. Dividends across the network sank toward 2 and 3%. Bond returns for equity risk on capital that could not be recovered. The Brontes' shares duly collapsed. Charlotte's letters from 1849 record it without self-pity. The money, she wrote, was probably lost, and many, she added, with her novelist's eye, had lost far more, those who had ventured what they could not afford on calls they could not meet. By then she had other griefs. Emily, who would not sell, was dead at 30, and the shares outlived her judgment only to vindicate her sisters. A small story, it stood and stands for 100,000 like it. And the Railway King? For Hudson, the falling market was the one enemy his method could not survive, because his method, at bottom, required rising subscriptions to pay the dividends that kept the subscriptions rising. Through 1848, the machine strained. In early 1849, it broke. A shareholder at one of his companies pressed awkward questions about shares Hudson had transferred. Committees of investigation were appointed at the Midland, at the York, and North Midland, at the eastern counties. And what they found, company by company, was the same. Dividends declared out of capital, accounts adjusted to suit, balances that existed on paper and nowhere else, and benefits to the chairman that had gone unrecorded and unexplained. The fall was total and swift in the way only the fall of an idol can be. The dukes vanished. The subscription monument was quietly abandoned. York struck his name where it could. He was pursued for enormous restitution, lost his fortune, lost his seat eventually, fled to the continent to keep ahead of arrest for debt, and was for a time imprisoned in York, the city that had worshipped him when he ventured back. He died in London in 1871, in modest lodgings, maintained at the end by a small fund raised by old railway hands who remembered whatever else, that he had built more of England than any man alive. Sit for a moment with the strangest scene of the fall, because contemporaries recorded it with something like awe. Through the winter of 1848 into 1849, Hudson still came to the House of Commons. A member could not be arrested for debt while Parliament protected him, and everyone knew that was partly why he came. The man who had been mobbed by admirers now walked the lobbies alone. Members who had begged for allotments in his companies, who had dined at Albert Gate and voted his bills through committee, looked through him as he passed. Nobody in the chamber had clean hands. The whole house had feasted on the Mania, and so the house did what implicated institutions do. It isolated the symbol and forgot its own subscription lists. Hudson bore it, by all accounts, without complaint and without apology, insisting to the end of his life that he had done as railwaymen did, only larger, that he had made money for thousands before he lost it, and that the rules he was condemned under had not existed when he acted. It is self-serving, and it is not entirely false, and holding both of those in mind at once is precisely the discipline this channel keeps asking of you. There is also the question of what happened to the wreckage, because 1,000 dead schemes do not simply vanish, they get digested. Through the 1850s, the survivors consolidated. The strong companies absorbed the broken ones at right-down prices, rationalized the duplicate routes the gauge wore and the Mania had spawned, and settled into the handful of great territorial systems, Midland, Great Western, London and North Western, North Eastern, that ran Britain's railways for the next 70 years. Investors who had bought at the top and somehow held through the ruin saw dividends recover slowly to modest respectability by the late 1850s. The network's traffic doubled and doubled again. In other words, the assets were good all along, at a third of the price. The Mania had not invented value that did not exist, like the South Sea. It had paid 3 times too much for value that did, and the difference between those two eras is the difference between nothing and a nation's infrastructure, purchased at a generation's expense. And the reckoning reshaped the law, in the slow British way, not in one great statute, but in a chain of them, each patching the hole the last disaster had found. The Companies Acts of the 1850s and 1860s built the modern limited company. Railway regulation acquired teeth by degrees, and the profession of the independent auditor, men whose whole trade was verifying that a declared dividend had actually been earned, grew up in the direct shadow of the Hudson revelations, staffed at first by the very accountants who had untangled his books. It is a pattern you will recognize from every episode in this series. Sarbanes-Oxley is a portrait of Enron, the lender of last resort is a portrait of Overend Gurney, and the Victorian audit is a portrait of the Railway King. Financial law is not designed. It is accreted, each layer the fossil of a specific catastrophe laid down while the wreck was still smoking. He was never criminally tried. As with the Overend directors, as at Enron, the line between catastrophic concealment and provable crime ran through territory the law of his day could not map. Much of what he did broke standards that were only written because of him. The Companies Acts, the slow invention of compulsory audit, the very idea that a public company's accounts must be true. The reforms of the following decades are, in large part, a portrait of George Hudson drawn in statute. Set the fall of Hudson beside the 2 other fallen names this channel has studied, and the pattern completes itself. The Quaker partners of Overend Gurney spent an inherited reputation and were acquitted. Hudson spent a self-made one and was never charged. The executives of Enron spent an institutional one, and a century and a half later, finally went to prison. Not because their conduct was worse, but because Hudson's disasters had, by then, built the laws to catch it. Each scandal purchases the statute that convicts its successor. That is the grim gift each generation of the ruined leaves the next, and it is why the study of these old collapses is not antiquarianism. The rules that protect your pension were written, clause by clause, in the wreckage of other peoples. And note what all 3 names had in common at their height. Each had become, functionally, a substitute for analysis. It's a Hudson line. Overends holds the paper. Enron's in the deal. In every case, the name ended the conversation that due diligence should have started. That was precisely its economic function, the reason it commanded a premium. A name that cannot be questioned is not a reputation. It is a blindfold rented by the hour, and the rent is collected at the end. So, the reckoning. Who paid and what was bought? The investors paid, above all the small ones, ruined by the double blade of falling shares and rising calls. Contemporary estimates put the capital sunk into railways by 1850 at a sum approaching £250 million, a figure vast beyond modern conversion, committed by hundreds of thousands of households, earning at the bottom returns of 2 or 3%. A decade of middle-class saving had been converted at ruinous personal cost into iron and earthworks. But here is the twist we promised, the one that separates this mania from every other in the catalogue. The iron and earthworks were real. Britain came out of the mania with 6,000 miles of working railway, the trunk network, substantially, that the country still uses. The cuttings your train runs through today, the viaducts, the great curves of line across the Pennines and the Shires, dug by hand by armies of navvies and paid for by the scorched savings of the 1840s. The South Sea Company left nothing. The tulip contracts left nothing. The railway mania left the circulatory system of the modern British economy. Cheap coal, cheap food, national markets, the platform for 50 years of industrial supremacy. Nothing else in the history of speculation has this shape at this scale, a bubble whose residue was not paper, but permanent works, still earning their keep 2 centuries on. Economists have a wry name for the pattern, the mania as financing mechanism. It appears again in our own era. The dot-com crash bankrupted the speculators and left behind the fiber optic network the internet then ran on cheaply for decades. Sometimes a bubble is how a society tricks itself into paying for infrastructure no rational investor would fund, with the cost falling, brutally and by lottery, on whoever happened to hold the paper when the music stopped. Whether that is a defense of manias or the darkest thing about them, we leave with you. The Brontës were not consoled by the timetables. So, what should we take from the railway mania? 4 things. First, a preliminary that frames the other 4. Notice how long the whole cycle took. From the Liverpool and Manchester's opening to the peak of the mania, 15 years. From peak to ruin, 2. From ruin back to quiet prosperity on the same assets, 10 more. A full generation's arc, which is precisely why the lessons never hold, because the people who learn them retire, and the asset that ruined their parents becomes, to their children, simply the boring old railway that always pays. Financial memory is not lost. It dies of old age, on schedule, roughly every 25 years. Mark the interval between 1846 and every mania since, and you will find the rhythm disquietingly steady. Now the lessons proper. The most dangerous bubbles grow on true stories. Everyone remembers to laugh at tulips. Nobody was ruined by doubting them. It is the real revolution, the railway, the internet, the genuine gas bank at the heart of Enron, that disarms skepticism, because the early doubters are proved wrong publicly year after year until doubt itself sounds like ignorance. When the underlying thing is real, the only question left is price, and price is exactly what a mania cannot see. Is it real? Is the wrong question in every boom. The question is, what am I paying for it, and what am I obliged to pay later? Second, find the instrument that turns into a debt. Every mania has one. Ask of any investment offered to you what the part-paid scrip holders of 1846 did not ask. What is the worst thing this piece of paper can require of me, and when would it require it? If the answer is more money precisely when everything is falling, you are not holding an asset with a downside. You are holding someone else's option on your solvency. Third, count the conflicted gatekeepers. Parliament held the shares it approved. The press sold the advertisements it should have doubted. There was no auditor to buy. When every checker profits from the boom, the absence of warnings is not evidence of safety. It is evidence of the conflict. The reforms that followed, company law, audit, disclosure, are the institutional memory of this lesson. They decay and are relearned roughly once a century. And fourth, the dividend is the last thing to trust. Hudson's empire was held aloft for years by the one number every investor watched and no law verified. Income can be imagined, accounts can be dressed, but a fat dividend feels like truth arriving in cash, even when it is your own capital or the next subscribers coming back to you with a bow on it. From Hudson to Madoff, the steady payout is the confidence trick's favorite costume for the excellent reason that it works. And one more figure deserves his footnote before we close, because he is the Mania's control experiment. The man who looked at 1845 and said no. The Glen Mutchkin Railway, a savage satire published at the boom's height, imagined two chances floating a line through an empty Highland glen and being buried in subscriptions. Its author, a sharp-eyed lawyer, meant it as a warning, and investors read it as a prospectus. It sold out. That is worth a moment's genuine awe. The Mania was warned, repeatedly, wittily, in its own newspapers, by its own writers. The Times thundered, Punch mocked, the satire named the tricks, and the warnings changed nothing, because a warning cannot compete with a neighbor's visible profits. Nobody in a mania lacks information. What they lack is the willingness to be the one fool standing out of the market while fools are being paid. Cassandra's problem was never her accuracy. The parsonage at Haworth is a museum now. The Midland Main Line still runs. Somewhere between those two facts lies the whole moral of the 1840s. A nation's savings turned to smoke and to steel in the same transaction, and a king whose only throne, all along, had been the willingness of strangers to believe the number beside his name. Sources and method. This account draws on the parliamentary record of the Railway Acts of the Mania years and the reports of the Committees of Investigation into the Hudson Companies of 1849, the contemporary reporting of the Times, the Economist and the Railway Press, the published letters of Charlotte Brontë concerning the York and North Midland shares, the sums and returns recorded in the standard economic histories of the Mania and the crisis of 1847, and the scholarly literature on George Hudson, on which opinion remains genuinely divided. Where the record is contested, above all how far Hudson knowingly deceived as against operating aggressively in an age without accounting rules, a question his investigators struggled with and historians still do, this video presents the evidence and the defense together. Figures for capital committed, mileage authorized, and dividend collapse are given as contemporaries, and later historians record them, rounded rather than falsely precise.